My father was in World War I. He volunteered shortly after we got in the war, went overseas as a dental surgeon, served in the same battalion with Harry Truman, as a matter of fact. He didn't talk much about the war, but I wondered sort of why. I kind of wanted to hear war stories. There were very few that he ever mentioned. Soldiers don't talk about their war experiences much. I found that with World War II. When you come back from a war, there's no way to explain the horror of it to civilians who haven't experienced it. And after one or two attempts, you see their eyes sort of glaze over, and they can't really associate any of their experience with anything that you've gone through. So from there on out, you kind of shut up. I went off to war as a United Press correspondent shortly after Pearl Harbor. I was 25 at the time.
Walter was one of the big guys in those days to me. I thought he was forever old. I didn't realize he wasn't much older than I was at the time. He seemed like the quintessential newspaper man to me.
The big story then was the Battle of the North Atlantic, and I went out on convoy duty.
Allied convoy eastward bound in the Atlantic. American patrol planes on the hunt for Nazi wolf pack.
We were escorting freighters, tankers, pretty good-sized convoy. The Germans got in among us 2 or 3 times. They sank several of the freighters, tankers out of our convoy. It was the first combat I'd ever seen. In those early months of the war, the Army having dictated we wear an Army officer's uniform, but they didn't give us any badge that said war correspondent. They just gave us a big green brassard with a great white C on it. Well, that first convoy, the chaplain introduced me to a group of young officers, and I noticed right away that their conversation seemed to die out. They stood around kind of embarrassedly looking at their coffee cups, and finally one of them cleared his throat. He said, "Excuse me, sir, but what denomination are you?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I'm kind of a backsliding Episcopalian, I guess you'd say. I don't go very often, though, I'm afraid." And they all looked at each other kind of puzzled, and finally one of them said, well, you are a chaplain, aren't you?" Apparently they thought that C meant chaplain. Well, I disabused them very quickly of that with a couple of dirty stories. My next big combat assignment was the Allied landing to North Africa, and it was a tough fight, a lot of resistance. I was the first reporter back from the landings in North Africa, and Paramount asked me to do a newsreel for them. I never had any real nervousness about appearing before a camera.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war, covering the occupation of North Africa by American troops. I represented the United Press, and when we were permitted to write, there was plenty to report.
These first films from Algiers tell the story of what long-distance war means in terms of ships, supplies, and men.
I never took any elocution lessons, no diction lessons. What you see, I'm afraid, is what you get. When the 8th Air Force began bombing Germany in 1943, they finally agreed to take along a few specially trained correspondents.
Here we were, roughly their age. We were just writing about them, and these aircraft would come back with dead and wounded on board, and we were embarrassed, and we decided that the thing to do was to go on a raid ourselves. So it ended up there were 6 of us.
And one of the things they taught us was how to use a .20 caliber machine gun. They decided, I guess, that we might as well be useful up there, and I had a great seat in the bombardier's nose in the Flying Fortress I flew in, manning the starboard gun. We had Focke-Wulf's and Messerschmitts fighting us for 2.5 hours on that mission, plus an awful lot of flak. We didn't get hit, obviously very happy to say, but several planes did. I think, if I remember, we lost about 11 planes out of something like 60 that made the mission. Pretty heavy loss.
The greatest war crimes trial in modern history proceeds at Nuremberg.
The trial of the top Nazis at Nuremberg was one of the really exceptional experiences of our time, I think, that any correspondent could have.
Worldwide News Service.
We sat there in that courtroom, just a few feet, those of us in the front row, from Goering, Hess, and Ribbentrop, and Schacht, and von Schirach, and so forth, on down the line.
Newsreel films of mass murders, ghastly evidence that should have stirred even the conscience of Goering.
The prosecutors made their case, of course, with the seized Nazi document and those terrible pictures of the concentration camps.
12 million men, women, and children have died murdered.
It was a tough story to write. It just simply seemed so unbelievable. I mean, as you wrote the thing, you said, who's going to believe this?
The war plotters and arch gangster killers of the Nazi hierarchy.
Some of them were sniveling. Gosh, you couldn't stand them. Stryker, Jew baiter, terrible man. You wanted to get up there and personally cut his throat. Hess was obviously mad as a hatter. Absolutely insane.
The drama ends. The ringleaders follow many of their lesser henchmen to the gallows.
From Nuremberg, I went to Moscow, where I was a United Press bureau chief for a couple of years, covering the outbreak of the Cold War. Well, I came home from Russia, and United Press sent me out on a speaking tour. I was speaking in Omaha one night, and I made this declaration. Everybody always asks at these speeches, will the Russians ever get the atomic bomb? And I pointed out the absolutely decrepit state of their economy and apparently their technology, and I said, I don't think they'll ever have the atomic bomb. And I walked out of the auditorium to find newspapers on the stand with a big headline, Russians explode a bomb.
They were living in Moscow, and my mother flew over the Berlin airlift to have me in Kansas City, because at that time Stalin would refuse permission for children born in his country to leave, and he would claim them as Soviet citizens. So she went back to her mom's to have me.
Good evening, everyone. Here is the news.
Next, Cronkite Remembers. Behind the scenes at the birth of television news.
Sometimes when things went wrong, they really went wrong.
Unfortunately, however, the film seems to be upside down. If we can get it right side up in time, we'll take a look at it for you.